Very well. Let me introduce the next expert. Hello, Dr. Johnstone. Good afternoon from London. I don't know if you are in London or in
near London. I'm about 100 miles west of London.
Okay, United Kingdom. And thank you for being with us. Lucy Johnstone is a member of the Division of Psychology of the British Psychological Association, is one of the main authors of the Power, Threat and Meaning framework, along with Mary Boyle, and a new approach underpinned by a review of the scientific literature aims to provide an alternative understanding of human suffering to the traditional diagnostic classification systems such as DSM and ICD. Okay, the title of her keynote is The Power, Threat, Meaning Framework, Non-Diagnostic Assessment. It's your time. Enjoy everyone this nice keynote. Please.
Thank you for that introduction. And I think we said that if anyone wants to add questions in the chat, we can come back to them at the end. And I will now try and do, shall we try and share screen? See if that works. It worked before, didn't it? Shall I click on share screen?
Okay.
Ah, looks like it's going to work. That's very good.
Very well.
So,
your time.
Okay, let me just see if I can start this.
Perfect.
Does that look okay to you? You can see this?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, great.
Go ahead.
Thank you for inviting me today. So I'm going to introduce you fairly briefly to this new framework, which is probably going to be a bit different from what you've heard in some of the other conference talks. Our attempt is certainly to produce something radically different, which doesn't assume there are such things as mental illnesses or disorders. It's a non-pathologizing approach. It's quite long and complicated, so I'm going to give you a flavor of it. You can have the recordings and you can have the slides, and I will also point you towards lots of other resources if you want to find out more about it afterwards. But for the moment, I just want to give you some sense of what it's about and what the implications are for assessment. I've actually been over to Spain a couple of times to talk about it, which has been great. So if there are some Spanish people here, nice to have you with us. So let me first introduce you to the document, the Power, Threat, Meaning Framework, which is freely available on the website. There is a shorter and a longer version of this. Even the shorter version is quite long. The longer version is 200,000 words, so you don't need to read it all, but if you were interested in finding out all the research and ideas that underpin this framework, then you can find it in the long document. And at least if you understand English, or there is supposed to be a Spanish version before too long, this is a kind of easy version, which you can buy from this UK publisher. It's a very practical version about how you might draw on these ideas with someone you're working with or supporting, or perhaps with yourself or a friend or family member, because the framework does not believe there is a separate group of people who are mentally ill. It says that we all suffer distress at times, we all struggle at times, and we all try to survive the best way we can. So very briefly, what is this about? The Power, Threat, Meaning Framework. As I've said, it's an attempt to outline an alternative to the diagnostic model. It was funded by my professional body, which is the Division of Clinical Psychology, but it's not a formal model that all UK psychologists have to use. Some agree with it, some don't. It's a set of ideas. It doesn't say you must do this in this situation, or this is how you should do assessment, or this is how you should run services. We wanted to put together a set of ideas so that if people were interested, they could take some of these ideas and think about what might this look like in practice, tell us about it, and then we can use that to develop the framework further. So it's a kind of ongoing project, if you like. And it isn't saying everything we're doing at the moment must stop. It is saying there's a lot of good practice out there, but most of it is diagnostically based. So we want to provide extra support for the non-diagnostic practice that is already out there, and also some new ways forward. And it has attracted a lot of interest, which is good. A lot of people seem to like it. Some people seem to dislike it. So it took 5 years to put these documents together, a very long, painful process, I would say. And the top paragraph is the names of the people who are the main authors. I and Mary Boyle are the two lead authors. We are clinical psychologists. Jackie Dillon and Eleanor Longden are survivors, people who've been through the psychiatric system, left it behind, and are campaigning for change. So in the UK, we call that a co-produced document. It's not just written by professionals. So most of the authors are psychologists, and as the project continued, we drew on a number of other people you can see listed there. There are about 40 people in total who contributed to the document, about a third of whom had experience of being in psychiatric services themselves. And there is a tradition in the UK of being very critical of diagnosis. There is a critical or radical tradition, which we were building on to some extent. So all the main authors are people who've known each other for many years. In fact, I've known Mary Boyle for 30 years, and we've always promoted critical non-diagnostic perspectives. So that was our starting point, if you like, to see if we could take that further. Here is a link to the main website if you want to read more, and the main and overview documents are available in Spanish. And as you can see, there has been quite a lot of interest from other countries around the world, and a number of other translations are in process. 5 other translations into 5 other languages are in progress. So what is this about? It's about moving away from what Mary Boyle has called the DSM mindset. So that doesn't mean just not using diagnostic labels. It means not starting with any of the assumptions that underpin diagnostic labels, not thinking that this is about something wrong with people, not thinking that these are illnesses. So it's critical of quite a lot of psychology as well as psychiatry. And just to put it very briefly, we are saying that at the moment we have a model that says we can understand human emotional distress in the same way that we can understand what goes wrong in people's bodies. And actually, the medical model works pretty well in understanding what goes wrong in people's bodies. We wouldn't want to be without all that in times of physical ill health or in times of a pandemic. But we are saying that model is not appropriate, not suitable for understanding what goes wrong in people's lives, people's emotional distress and suffering. We need a very different kind of model which understands people's distress as arising within their relationships, their social circumstances, and their political environments. And the result of that, things that are sometimes called symptoms, can be seen as people trying their very best to make sense of what's happened to them and survive difficult circumstances, which we all do. We all do. So this framework aims to fulfill the purposes of diagnosis better than diagnosis. That's predicting the best way forward and working out what the causes are and so on. But in addition to that, the framework says we need to recognize that emotional distress and troubled or troubling behavior are understandable responses to a person's history and circumstances, even in very extreme cases. Even in the cases you might call psychosis, these are ultimately understandable responses, often to very difficult life events. It's about restoring the link between distress and social injustice. These are not individual problems. They arise, if you trace them back and back and back, they arise within contexts, nearly always, that are of inequality and injustice. The aim of the framework is to leave people feeling more powerful, more access to resources. Instead of a diagnostic label, the framework encourages people to create a narrative. It's a bit like a formulation, but broader than that. So a narrative which makes sense of what's happened in their lives and the sense they've made of it and the wider context of everything that's gone on in their lives, and which promotes social action. It's not just about what do I need to do to feel better? It's about social action. What do we need to do better so we reduce distress and create a better, fairer world for everybody? So this has something in common with formulation. I think you've had a presentation on formulation. I think you're going to have another. So formulation is a very well-established practice in UK clinical psychology. All UK clinical psychologists use formulation. In other words, drawing on the evidence to sit down with the person in front of you, client or patient, to think about an evidence-based hypothesis. We think that this is the reasons for your distress, and therefore we think this may be a good way forward. And that's often presented in a diagrammatic form or a few paragraphs. So formulations can be used in assessment. They are used in assessment in quite a lot of places in the UK, and I would certainly use a formulation in assessment in clinical practice. A power threat meaning framework narrative includes formulations, but it's wider than that. It includes all the many ways people can make sense of their distress, perhaps through art, music, poetry, perhaps particularly in some non-Western cultures, through community rituals and myths and legends and so on. So it's formulations, but more than formulations. But the power threat meaning framework provides a way, it's not the only way, and nobody has to do this, of course, a way of constructing a narrative, which is a bit like a formulation, but potentially wider than a formulation. So from a framework point of view, this would be your starting point. And I'm not even sure we call it assessment. You know, we would call it meeting with a person and getting to know them. But it could serve the purpose that is sometimes served by the process we call assessment. So instead of an assessment, instead of a diagnosis, instead of a narrow version of a formulation, we might have a PTMF narrative. And I'm just going to show you what that might look like. So the power threat meaning framework is based on several core questions, and these questions themselves are based on an awful lot of evidence. For example, they're based on the evidence that what has happened to you in your life has a significant effect on whether you suffer distress and perhaps what kind of distress you suffer from. So the questions are evidence-based, if you like, and the questions can form the basis of sitting down with someone, talking through and coming up with a shared narrative about the reasons for that person's distress. And the little book I showed you earlier, with the yellow cover, describes in some detail how you can do that if you want to look at that at some point. So I'm now going to talk you through the core questions. The first one is what has happened to you? And in PTMF terms, we call that how is power operating in your life? The second one is how did it affect you? What kind of threats does this pose? The third one is what sense did you make of it? In other words, what was the meaning of these experiences to you? The fourth one is what did you have to do to survive? In other words, what kind of threat responses are you using? And these are two other questions you might want to add or start with. What are your strengths? In other words, what access to power resources do you have? And you would pull it together into what is your story. Now, probably you wouldn't want to use that literally in these words in that order. This is not another version of a set of assessment questions. These are areas to consider. Probably you'd want to use different language to different people according to what makes sense for them. Probably you'd want to come back to it. You'd want to sort of start and go around the questions again. And as you will see when we go through them, the questions are not separate. They're not this plus this plus this. Each question is a different perspective on the same set of experiences. So they're very much overlapping. When I've gone through the questions, I'm right at the end of the talk, I'm going to show you an example of a narrative that is put together based on these questions, and I hope that will bring it to life a bit. But first of all, I'm going to go through the questions one by one. So what has happened to you? How was power operating in your life? So the framework puts a great deal of emphasis on thinking about the role of power in our lives. And we mean power in the broadest sense. And it is our argument that psychiatry and a lot of psychology and a lot of psychotherapy doesn't pay sufficient attention to the many forms of power that operate in our lives, that psychiatry and psychology and psychotherapy very often focus too much on what's gone wrong with the individual and what you need to do to put your life right, without looking at all the influences around you. So we're against any approach that is individualizing, if you like. And that's why power comes first and foremost. So you don't need to read all this writing, but these are the different kinds of forms of power that we think everybody needs to think about. If we're working with someone or supporting them, we need to think about the way legal powers operate in their life. And these are overlapping forms of power, of course. They're not distinct categories. We need to think about their economic and material power. Do they have enough money to live on? Do they have a decent house? Do they have enough money to buy food for their family? We need to think about interpersonal power. And in the UK and in America and some other countries, there is a tradition called trauma-informed practice. I'm not sure how strong that is in wherever you're coming from, wherever you are, but trauma-informed practice acknowledges the roles of all sorts of adversities in people's life, the things that go wrong between people, neglect and abuse and violence and so on and so on. We're used to thinking about that as therapists, but as therapists, we're not always used to thinking about the other forms of power. There's coercive power, which of course can happen in relationships, in domestic violence, for example. There is embodied power. There's whether we are able-bodied or attractive or have certain strengths and talents, or whether we lack those. There is social or cultural capital, which is a really important thing to think about. It's the kind of hidden advantages that we are more likely to have if we are, let's say, white and educated and middle class. But we could say that men tend to have more access to those advantages than women. We tend not to think about those so much when we're thinking about someone's distress. But actually, that's often very important. And if we give someone a diagnostic label, we are providing an extra barrier to forms of social capital. We're making it more difficult for people to find employment. We're making it more difficult for their voices to be heard and them to find a place in society. And finally, ideological power, which is a very central part of the framework. This is a more hidden form of power, which is harder to pin down because it very often seems like just the way the world is or just the way things should be. And it involves control of language, meaning, and perspective. So we might think of this as social norms or expectations. They're all around us. We all make assumptions, and we are encouraged to make assumptions about how we ought to live, the kind of relationships we ought to have, the kind of achievement we ought to aim for, what it means by being a good mother or being successful or a happy family or a normal child, the stereotypes we have about certain groups in societies, perhaps particularly minority groups with less power, and the kind of social and political policies that are sold to us, often by use of language. So in the UK, as you know, I'm sure we have been sold the policy of Brexit. Very bad idea, in my view. I apologise for my country for behaving so shamefully, and a lot of people don't agree with it. But whether or not you agree with it, it is undeniable this was sold to us by certain forms of, we were told to be terrified about all the immigrants who were going to come and flood our welfare system. We were told lies about all the benefits that would come from Brexit. And this was an ideologically driven project. Certain people who are already more wealthy and powerful are going to benefit from this, and those who are already less wealthy and powerful are going to suffer from it. And here's a controversial statement. From the point of view of the framework, we see the biomedical model of psychiatry as an example of ideological power. It does not have evidence to support it. It tends to operate to the advantage of people who are already more powerful, mental health professionals, drug companies, and so on. It, on the whole, tends to suck in people who are already more vulnerable, have had a harder time because that's why they're in services in the first place, and tends to take power away from them and does this partly by adding very stigmatizing labels, which too often set them on a lifelong path of a psychiatric patient career, if you like, where drugs and all sorts of other interventions sometimes make it less rather than more likely that they will recover. And to whose advantage does this work? Well, there have been many critiques of psychiatry, as I'm sure you know, which argue that actually psychiatry operates to some extent in the interests of all the most powerful groups in society. It sweeps up the casualties of our way of life. It labels them as having a personal, individual illness, and then things carry on much as before. So that's power. How did it affect you? I won't go through this in detail because this follows obviously from thinking about power. If power can operate helpfully and supportively, of course, power isn't bad in itself. So mental health professionals like myself have a certain amount of power, and we all want to use it helpfully, don't we? Of course we do. That's why we're in our jobs. But the people who come into our services are nearly always going to have been on the receiving end of negative uses of power. So that may threaten their relationships. They may suffer from overwhelming emotions. They may lack links to their social circles and communities. They may not have enough money to live on. They may experience threats to the environment. But I mean, all of these apply to all of us as well. It's just that the people who end up in services tend to have had a more difficult time on average. But this applies to all of us. We're all facing environmental threats, for example. Threats to your body, not least from psychiatric drugs, which in the long term are often very harmful to people's bodies. Most importantly, threats to your value base and meaning making. Again, we don't usually think about this, but to what extent are people who end up in services encouraged to make their own sense of their distress? Very often people who come into services have a sense, an intuitive sense, or they know this is something to do with the fact that I was neglected as a child, or I was raped, or I was abused. And yet services impose a meaning on them, nearly always, by telling them they have a disorder or an illness. And this imposition leaves them open to further power abuses, enforced medication, let's say. And people are strongly discouraged from saying, I don't think I've got schizophrenia, or I don't think I've got bipolar disorder. That's not a safe thing to say in many services. What sense did you make of it? So this is, everything else gets filtered through this. The sense we make of our events is bound to influence how badly or perhaps how well we come out of them. And we know this, certainly if we're therapists, we know this. Therapy is all about working with meaning. It's the meanings people bring to us that we discuss with people in therapy. But in the power threat meaning framework, we want to think beyond personal meaning. This is another way that we want to go beyond most therapeutic practice. Some therapeutic practice does look at wider meanings. So we want to think about, where do our meanings come from? You can see as I go through the questions, I'm coming back to the same themes again and again, because as I said, these are not separate questions, but our personal meanings come from the messages we hear around us. So many of us will know that, people come into services, but we all experience this to an extent, feeling I shouldn't feel like this. I should be coping better as a mother, or I should be achieving more, or I shouldn't be struggling, I shouldn't look like this, or whatever. So the meanings that people have don't arise just from inside their heads. They come from social norms and expectations, and those meanings themselves come from wider discourses. So an example I often give is that I've spent a lot of my career working with women who have been raped and sexually abused, and very often these women have never told anyone about it, and each and every woman, when they're able to talk about it, has said, I feel so guilty and ashamed, it's my fault, I shouldn't have done this, or I should have done that, I feel to blame, I must be a bad person. So each of these meanings, even though they were held very secretly, actually had a lot in common with every other woman's meaning. So it makes sense to say, well, where do those meanings come from? And of course, those meanings come from lots of wider messages about how women ought to behave and how men ought to behave and whose responsibility it is, and so on and so on. And at an ideological level, you could say that it suits us as a society to end up with women themselves feeling they're to blame, rather than looking wider at the fact that there is so much routine abuse and violence in women's lives, and streets are unsafe and all the rest of it. So one way of countering that is not just to sit down with women on a one-to-one basis, but to have groups where we can discuss very openly, where do these meanings come from? And we can start to put responsibility back where it belongs, and we can start to relieve our personal sense of guilt and shame. And in the case of some of the women who have been through these groups, which I've been involved in running, they were then able to turn, I would call it, from victim to survivor, to join us to train other staff in the impact of abuse and trauma, to set up self-help groups and so on. So that'd be very much in line with the power threat meaning framework. Of course, we didn't invent that. That kind of stuff's been around for ages. And I'm not saying this is just about women. Men also suffer characteristic forms of abuse and shaming, and can also end up victims of abuses of power. So what did you have to do to survive? So we call these threat responses, and they overlap with what you might call psychiatric symptoms, but they're not exactly the same as psychiatric symptoms. So threat responses can range from some that are more automatic and biologically based, like a sense of panic or fight, flight, freeze, where you have very little control over it. But they can also be forms of reacting which are more deliberately adopted. We might eat too much or use alcohol. We might feel we haven't got a lot of control over that, but to some extent we are deciding to do that. And we might also engage in behaviours which don't get a psychiatric label because they are socially valued. We might work much, much too hard, or we might do all sorts of things which are actually a way of coping with overwhelming feelings, let's say, or difficulties. But they're not going to get as psychiatrically labelled because in a particular society they tend to be valued. So some of these are seen as normal or desirable, and these threat responses are bound to be to some degree culture specific. So certain behaviours are valued in some cultures, less so in others. And the more automatic bodily responses are more likely to be universal across cultures, but the more culturally shaped ones are likely to be different. So you can't be an alcoholic if you live in a society where you can't buy alcohol, for example. And currently in many Western societies, there is a kind of, at some level, an encouragement to self-harm was a way of relieving distress. That didn't used to be the case about 30 years ago in the UK, and it's not the case everywhere. So there's a lot of cultural shaping that goes on. And we do not think it makes a lot of sense to say what causes depression or what causes anxiety. We think the only possible answer to that is, well, lots of things. There are lots of reasons people might feel anxious or feel miserable or feel desperate. So the sensible question is, what function, what purpose is that threat response serving for you in these situations? There can't be a universal answer, and there can't be a simple causal link, because everybody's different, and the meaning we make of these experiences and events is always bound to be different for each individual, although there will be some common themes. So one of the main purposes of the framework is to put back the link between threats and threat responses. And another way of saying the same thing is to put back the link between personal distress and wider contexts of social injustice. So as soon as you say, aha, you've got depression or you've got a disorder, you are cutting that link. You are seeing the problem as within the individual. And the framework wants to put that link back again. So we see people in their contexts. And this is, I always think this is odd, because at some level we know that, for example, people brought up in poverty are more likely to feel desperate and miserable. And as soon as we acknowledge that, we then talk about epidemics of depression and developing new pills. So we acknowledge the link and then we kind of conceal it behind a label. And by doing that, we don't offer people the best help, and we don't deal with whatever the wider roots of the feelings of desperation are. So again, we would argue there are many vested interests in resisting making that connection between people's distress and the context they come from. And I think you can see this very clearly in the case of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, which I know that you suffered from very badly, as we have in the UK, thanks to our useless government. Okay, so we're seeing a lot of stuff in the press, I don't know if you are, about we need much, much more mental health services because everybody's going to be mentally ill after COVID. And yet, if you look at the research, you find those who are most likely to be so-called mentally ill are people who have struggled more for obvious reasons, people who've been hardest hit financially, frontline healthcare workers, women who've been juggling lots of different tasks at once. So, in other words, it makes sense that some people are going to be struggling emotionally. We wouldn't call it a mental health problem. We would say people are emotionally struggling. So I wrote this article saying that in ordinary language, people with more to be exhausted, depressed and anxious about are feeling more exhausted, depressed and anxious. That's what we're seeing. We're not seeing an outbreak of mental illness. We are seeing the understandable responses of being lacking money and financial insecurity and exhausting jobs and childcare for months on end and living in isolation. And the answer to that is not a label and more mental health services. The answer is more financial support and children going back to school and us remaking our connections. So that's an example of disconnecting the threat from the threat responses, as opposed to putting it together and saying these are understandable responses to very difficult situations. Okay, I'm going to talk very, very briefly about another aspect of the framework. I haven't got time to go into it, but we have made an attempt, and this is an ongoing attempt, to show how people's personal narratives tend to be part of much bigger narratives which work at a level of a whole society or culture. So every individual narrative has got something unique about it, but every individual narrative of why this person is feeling distress is also, because we are saying it doesn't come from nowhere, it comes from a wider narrative that is probably quite common in a particular society or culture. So we've put together a first attempt at some meta-narratives, bigger narratives, which work at the level of whole societies and cultures, which are also, we are arguing, based on evidence. We didn't just invent them. And this is one example. So these are the kind of replacements of what diagnosis tries to do in a way. A diagnosis is about identifying a pattern in the way your body responds. So diabetes is about identifying a pattern of responses in your body related to your pancreas and your insulin supply and so on. The equivalent for emotional distress is identifying patterns in narratives and meanings and stories. So this pattern, I don't know if you've got time to read that, but as I say, you can have the slides. This is a pattern that is quite common in men who end up in the criminal justice system. It's not a pattern for prisoners, and it is found outside the criminal justice system as well, and sometimes in women, but it's quite common. And again, there's lots of evidence to support this, that people who end up in the criminal justice system come from this kind of background of violence and neglect and abuse. And the second part of the pattern, this particular pattern, is this. And this is about where do these family patterns come from? And of course, they come very often from the bigger contexts, which are families growing up on the margins of societies where there's a great deal of unemployment and competition for jobs, and where people are left feeling ashamed and excluded from society, perhaps particularly men, if they're not able to find a role for themselves. So you end up with very marginalized families who are, in some senses, the victims of what we might call structural violence. You know, whole societies, whole cultures, whole parts of towns and cities that are denied resources and opportunities. And of course, that affects individual families. Violence is played out more within families, and that affects individual people. And it wouldn't be uncommon for a particular man from this kind of background to end up in the criminal justice system. So if you looked at it like this, instead of saying these men have antisocial personality disorder, you would be saying we need to have very different ways of running our societies and supporting these men so that we don't end up just creating more and more people who are going to end up in our prison cells. We have a very high rate of incarceration in the UK because, at least partly because we have a very economically unequal society, particularly at the moment. Okay, so very briefly, the Power Threat Meaning Framework has quite a lot to say about culture. So diagnostic models are being exported across the globe. So countries and cultures that didn't know they needed our diagnostic culture, in my view, they don't, are being encouraged to take on a diagnostic model, even though both beyond Europe and beyond the UK and within the UK, there are cultures and communities which do not use diagnostic narratives and don't need them. They have their own narratives. So the framework, if we had a framework-based understanding in largely westernized societies, we would not be saying to other cultures, you need to take on this framework. You would not be saying you need to take on a diagnostic narrative. We'd be saying you have your own ways of understanding distress, which are just as valid within your culture. So if you want to read a little bit about sort of fascinating experiences of doing a compare and contrast, comparing the Power Threat Meaning Framework with understandings of distress in Maori cultures in New Zealand, when I went there a couple of years ago, and to some extent in Australia with some Aboriginal understandings of distress. So what we found was that actually in some ways the Power Threat Meaning Framework narratives could run alongside, not take over, but run alongside Indigenous understandings, which also, although they're very different, in some ways had similarities. They were also about threats and meanings and how we make sense of difficult circumstances in our lives. So the framework very much encourages us to look beyond the things we know about, the abuses, the trauma, the poverty, and also think about colonization and the whole way in how in Western societies we have lost a lot of richness in our understandings. We very much see ourselves as separate from each other, from the natural world. Actually, Indigenous cultures have a lot more to teach us, I think, than we have to teach them, particularly in understanding different forms of distress. Okay, so what are the implications for assessment? Well, as you can see, if you were doing something called assessment, then the framework would support a formulation-based approach, but the framework would not be basing this on a psychiatric diagnostic understanding or disorder understanding. It would not just be looking at causal influences within the individual. It would have a strong focus on abuses of power. It would encourage any form of narrative, and the interventions would be likely to go beyond the standard ones. It would be culturally sensitive and respectful, we hope. And, you know, we're also saying that actually you don't need to go to mental health services to gain an understanding of your distress. You can find alternative ways, and the framework is one of those alternative ways. And you may do just as good a job reflecting on it yourself with the aid of some of the framework materials or with someone who is using the framework to guide your discussion. So this is a very different model of assessment. It's not about experts working out what's wrong with the person. It's not about deficits. It's about how you've managed to survive. It's not about symptoms. It's about the creative ways in which you're coping, which may be problematic. There may be better ways of coping, but actually they started off being helpful and necessary. And it's not about something wrong with you at an individual level. It's about you surviving in a difficult world, as we all have to do. So I'm going to show you very briefly a narrative from a woman called Amanda, who came across the framework, and she runs a peer support group in the north of England. So this is people who have been in the psychiatric system or currently are, but who get together to support each other without professional help. And they decided to take the framework questions and talk together as a group without any professional input about whether that helped them to make sense of their lives and their distress in different ways. And Amanda, who set up the group, did this for herself in terms of her own story. And she's kindly allowed me to share this in my talks. So I'll show you what it looks like. Might not have time to read this in detail. As I say, you can have the recording and you can have the slides. But she thought, first of all, about the impact of power on her life. And like many people who end up in services, she's been through a very difficult time in her life. But also, like many people, unfortunately, she experienced further abuses of power within services. So the place she turned to for help turned out to actually, in some ways, leave her worse off. And she was told she had a personality disorder. So she believes that all of this had this effect on her life. She experienced many forms of threats from other people, threats to her body, threats to her relationships. You know, every area of her life felt unsafe, basically. And as a result, you know, she was very seriously distressed and sometimes suicidal. So perhaps not surprisingly, as a result of this, she began to believe these things about herself. She had these beliefs. These are the meanings she made of her experiences. She believed that she was worthless, undeserving, that she was stuck with a kind of disorder, and that actually there was no way forward. And these were her threat responses. Now, in psychiatric terms, you might call these symptoms. She calls them threat responses. And I think when you understand her story, at least even if only briefly, you can see actually these threat responses make sense. It is not surprising she ended up feeling and behaving like this. It's not surprising she sometimes verbally aggressive to staff because she found it very difficult to trust them. She had been quite badly treated by some of them. It's not surprising she sometimes tried to escape from life. It's not surprising she tried to control her eating because everything else felt out of control. However, partly with the help of the framework, she was also able to see that she has a lot of strengths. She's read a lot about the impact of trauma. She's set up the group. She's met other people and they support each other. She's had some good experiences with professionals, and she has a family who support her and help her get through the day. So too often, I think we just see people as a bundle of things that are wrong with them, and we forget to see how courageous they are and what a lot they've done to survive. So if you put it all together, this is how she put together her story. And if you read that, I think you'll see that, you know, this is very honest. It's certainly saying there were a lot of difficulties, there still are a lot of difficulties, but it's also saying that there are reasons for the way I'm struggling, and I have lots of strengths, and there are a lot of good things that are happening. And you can see this is a narrative. It's a very different kind of narrative from I have a personality disorder. It's a very, very different narrative. It's an empowering narrative. It's a healing narrative. And she and her group found the framework actually very helpful in giving them different ways of thinking about their experiences and different ways forward. Now, these are not easy answers, are they? They're not. This doesn't lead us to an easy answer, but it does at least suggest there could be more hopeful ways forward, which in fact she's already using. And one of the ways forward has been that she has joined the Power Threat Framework Committee, and she is now offering training in the Power Threat Meaning because she knows what it's like to think about it in relation to herself, and she's become an experienced trainer, and of course there's extra power in hearing about it from someone who's been through the system themselves and can talk about what it meant in terms of their lives. So if we called that an assessment, I mean, I wouldn't call it an assessment, but if we did, or something like that, then these are the implications. There are some implications for someone like Amanda in services. You would want to offer her what I would call trauma-informed education, information about the impact of abuse and so on people's minds and bodies. You would want to talk to the staff about how you can understand Amanda differently so that we can offer the kind of support that would be helpful to her. If you're more ambitious, you want to have a very different kind of service altogether that wasn't based on diagnostic labels. I mean, that's thinking a long way ahead. Outside services, you'd want to support peer groups, self-help groups. You might want, like Amanda, to be involved in campaigning and training in very different ways of understanding distress. Wider implications, well, as societies, we need to think about the huge prevalence of trauma, don't we? We need to think about the many families who are left on the edge of society struggling. We need to think about people's educational opportunities or lack of. We need, in framework terms, to challenge the medical model of distress, which helps us to conceal really all the things we most need to be doing and to label and pathologize people who are actually better seen as survivors than sufferers of an illness. And I'm pleased to tell you that the framework has been taken on, in some small ways, some bigger ways, quite widely in the UK. And one example is in a service in Northwest London where they're doing, they've introduced it to their inpatient wards. They started off with 2 inpatient wards, and it's now rolled out to the other 12 inpatient wards. So I don't want to say that the whole service has dramatically changed and looks completely different and nobody ever talks diagnostic language, because they do. To some extent, this is running alongside the standard approach, but it's having very good results. So this is an example of a regular meeting that the staff on these wards have to discuss particular patients on the wards. As you can see, they think about, this is the end result. They have a piece of paper on the wall and they all discuss what are the power influences in this person's life, how can we understand their threat responses, how can we understand the meanings that they have developed. And the idea is to think a bit about better ways forward for this person. So that would form the basis of a plan. You could call that the basis of an assessment, but it doesn't look very like a standard assessment. But it's the basis of a plan which would be shared with the person about what might be the ways forward. And there would also be a personal version, a one-to-one version that the person themselves would take part in, which would look a bit like this as well. And they've done some evaluations, and this is a small scale project so far, but so far it's looking good. Staff are reporting this is helpful, dramatic reduction in restraint and seclusion. And again, there's a small number of inpatients they've interviewed so far, but the ones they did interview were strongly agreeing that this helped them to find a better way forward. So that's a flavour of it. No magic instant answers, but some different principles and some different ways forward. And I'm sorry if that was a bit much and a bit of a rush through. I'm going to now stop share, and then we can have a bit of time for questions. I'm going to look at the chat if I can.
Okay, okay.